Welcome to a decade that redefined movies as we know them. An era where concepts were high and the budgets were higher. A time when technology allowed for the full reinvention of genres. A period when action heroes evolved, blockbusters nearly collapsed, and a revolution began in the shadows of Hollywood. This was the 90s. This was the end of the century. By the late 1990s, independent cinema had been absorbed, scaled, and professionalized. Studios owned the pipelines, festivals functioned as marketplaces, prestige had become strategy, and difference had become the formula. The industry believed it had learned how to manage rebellion, how to package it, and how to replicate it. What it had not been prepared for was what happens when independence stops needing the system at all. The next disruption would not arrive through prestige campaigns or festival bidding wars. It would arrive in a form Hollywood didn't know how to process: cheap, strange, uninvited. In the middle of all this consolidation, there was still room for something Hollywood could not engineer: a true outsider. The Blair Witch Project did not emerge from a studio pipeline. It was conceived outside the system, shot with non-professional actors, made for a tiny budget, built around a formal limitation that became its strength. The found footage approach was not new. Cannibal Holocaust and Italian Mondo films had already weaponized shaky cameras and recovered footage for shock value. The Blair Witch flipped the formula. Technical limits became narrative credibility, and imperfection became authenticity. The found footage device was not just stylistic, it was economic. By framing the film as recovered material, the filmmakers turned constraints into immersion. Low production values became part of the illusion. The lack of polish became proof. What followed was not a traditional marketing campaign. It was a cultural experiment, something that took place pre-YouTube, pre-Twitter, pre-social media as we know it. Blair Witch invented viral cinema on dial-up internet and GeoCities pages. Websites blurred fiction and reality, missing person reports were staged. Early message boards amplified the mystery. The boundary between story and marketing dissolved. By the time the film reached theaters, it did not feel like a movie. It felt like a rumor. The Blair Witch Project would go on to gross roughly $250 million worldwide, on total costs that didn't even reach $500,000. A return on investment so extreme it made Pulp Fiction's success look incremental. For Hollywood, this was not just a hit. The story of 3 students searching for the proverbial witch was a shock to both audiences and the industry. It rewrote the risk equation: tiny negatives, massive upside, minimal stars, maximum return. And the industry took another lesson: find the next Blair Witch. That was the mistake. What followed was not just imitation, it was institutional response. Studios and distributors began building acquisition strategies around micro-budget discovery. Horror became a testing ground. Festivals became scouting missions. Viral marketing became an internal discipline. The goal was no longer to nurture original voices. It was to locate statistical anomalies, ROI outliers that could be bought cheap and scaled fast. The next $600,000 negative. The next $200 million upside. But that was already a category error. Because after all, Blair Witch was not a formula. It was an event, a collision of format, timing, mythology, and emerging internet culture. Something the industry could imitate on the surface, but not in effect. It did not just change the economics of horror, it changed the terms of fear. And in a way, it was a back-to-basics journey. What mattered was no longer spectacle, but implication. No creature effects, no explanatory logic, just dread, absence, and the sense that reality itself had become unstable. That influence spread quickly. Found footage imitators would follow for years, chasing the same unease with shaky cameras, implied menace, and stripped down realism. But as with the business lesson Hollywood took from Blair Witch, it was easier to imitate the surface than recreate the conditions that made it work. What made Blair Witch disruptive was not just its genre, it was its position. It proved that the film could be created outside the system and yet explode inside the system. However, that would imply it would later be absorbed by it. The film was acquired by Artisan and later folded into larger corporate catalogs. Sequels followed. Ownership shifted. What began as pure DIY success became a managed franchise. The economic lesson came with a creative cost. As control shifted, the original creators lost long-term ownership. Revenue participation changed. Creative direction evolved. Exploitation outlived intention. Blair Witch proved independence could break through. It also proved that ownership would not follow it. Hollywood did not simply learn from Blair Witch. It learned how to hunt for its shadow. The Blair Witch Project terrified audiences, but the thing it scared the most was Hollywood itself, by proving it did not need it to make a hit. But if Blair Witch represents the outsider shock, Office Space represents its mirror image. A studio film that lived like an indie. On paper, Office Space was not independent. It had been written and directed by Mike Judge and produced by 20th Century Fox, receiving the backing of a major studio and released through traditional channels. By industry standards, it was a commercial failure. And marketing struggled to define it, even though the premise was specific and the tone was deadpan. However, the satire targeted office culture in ways that it did not test well. Fox spent millions marketing to 1999 audiences. Office workers spent zero. They just photocopied TPS cover sheet. The film underperformed theatrically. But Office Space did not die. It moved into the space where independent films had always learned to thrive, where survival came in the shape of a lifeline that gave him a second life. Home video, cable television, word of mouth, video stores, and office culture itself. Theatrical performance still defined success on paper, but cultural life increasingly happened elsewhere. First VHS, then DVD, cable rotation, internet message boards, and offline conversations. Office Space proved that films no longer lived or died in a single weekend. They accumulated meaning over time. The title eventually found its audience not through campaigns but through recognition. People did not just watch it, they adopted it. Quotes became shorthand. Characters became archetypes. The film became a shared language for a generation of workers. PC Load Letter was not just a joke. It captured something deeper, the absurdity of digital age office life, where machines failed, language lost meaning, and bureaucracy turned irritation into atmosphere. Milton, with his stapler and muttered resentment, stopped feeling like an exaggeration and started feeling very familiar. Like many true indies, the title was discovered late, shared socially, and kept alive by the communities that saw themselves in it. What Office Spaces revealed was a structural blind spot. Studios were optimized to measure opening weekends. They still are, but they are not optimized to measure cultural adoption. And by the end of the 1990s, that distinction mattered more than ever. 1999 would later be remembered as one of the great movie years in modern cinema. The year that saw the release of titles like The Matrix, Fight Club, The Sixth Sense, Election, The Big Lebowski, Being John Malkovich, and Magnolia. Very different films, but all part of the same larger mood. The old categories were loosening. Studio and indie, prestige and genre, mainstream and marginal. Audiences were responding to movies that felt stranger, sharper, and less obedient to the rules Hollywood still thought mattered most. The audience independent cinema had spent 3 decades cultivating was no longer behaving like a mass audience. It was Those viewers did not always show up in predictable box office ways, but they did show up over time. And that is what made Office Space valuable. It escaped the studio's definition of value long enough to become part of culture. And that's ultimately why this title is important to this story. Because beyond untimely popularity, it's what the movie reveals about the system. The studio made a film with an indie sensibility, then failed to recognize what it had. And audiences reclaimed it anyway, which meant the lesson was different this time. Whereas Blair Witch exposed the limits of studio production, Office Space exposed the limits of studio perception. Hollywood could still miss the culture, even when it financed the movie itself. And Judge's film proved that indie was not just a production model. It was a way audiences connected to stories. A tone, frequency, a way of recognizing yourself on screen before market knew how to price that recognition. The studio could manufacture the accident. What it could not manufacture was recognition. By the turn of the millennium, independent cinema had reached a strange conclusion. It had won. Not because the rebellion ended, but because it had been absorbed into the very structures it once existed to escape. The language of indie had become mainstream. Its aesthetics had been adopted, its talent pipelines fed the studios, its prestige machinery had been institutionalized. But independence itself had not survived intact. The story had come full circle. In the 1970s, filmmakers sought autonomy from the studios. They built production companies, they chased control. The studios responded by pulling risk back into the systems. In the 1990s, independent cinema rebuilt itself from the margins. The response was the same, not destruction, absorption. Blair Witch showed what happened when outsiders broke the model. Office Space showed what happened when the model failed to recognize what it had already made. In both cases, the lesson pointed in the same direction. Once disruption proves it can create value, the industry stops treating it as a threat and starts treating it as a template. This pattern did not end in 1999. It became the operating logic of the next era. The names may have changed, and so have the interfaces and rhetoric. But the structural reflex did not. New players emerged. Boutique distributors like A24, new financing models, fresh international voices. Boutique channels promised taste curation and creative freedom. Streaming promised reach, access, escape from old gatekeepers. And for a while, each looked like independence's new home. But the structure was familiar. Algorithms replaced executives, data replaced instinct, and platforms replaced studios. Half a century after New Hollywood, the same tension remains. Only now it lives inside algorithms and not studio commissaries. The directors sign multi-picture deals with the likes of Netflix and Apple. Stars launch vanity shingle brands. Everything depends on platform distribution and data infrastructure. And even if the storefront looks democratic, the supply chain is not. Today, the aesthetic is more level than ever. TikTok edits borrowing the grammar. Cheap digital tools flatten visual hierarchies. And still, through it all, the infrastructure remains concentrated. New boutique brands emerge. New platform ecosystems form. The language changes. The absorption pattern does not. So in a way, independent cinema did not disappear. It changed the system, and then the system absorbed that change back into itself. That is the paradox at the heart of American independent film. The rebellion does not fail, it succeeds. And once it succeeds, the industry learns how to use it. A movement appears in the margins, changes the grammar, creates new value. It gets absorbed, and then, somewhere else, under new names and conditions, it all starts over again.